Hi, everyone. Thank you for taking your time to join the session. Pleasure to virtually be at the same time, not at the same place, not at the same time. I hope you find this session interesting and fruitful. To introduce myself quickly, my name is David Avshalom. I'm the VP of Product Strategy and Operations at Playroll. Predominantly, I'm focused on our global payroll solution space. But today, I will be focusing on the market perspective of running global payroll. And the stance I will be making is around the complexity that still lives within running payroll processes in a global landscape for a multinational business. The mindset is more focused on mid-market businesses. Multinational, as I mentioned, is the key. And while in this day and age, it feels like we're in a space where everything becomes automated and streamlined, the reality is that there are still plenty of pitfalls within payroll processes, and the complexity hasn't disappeared. It shows up as fragmented systems. Spreadsheets still dominate a lot of workflows and processes. Processes break when they meet local requirements. Global systems do not comply necessarily with local requirements in many cases, and clients or businesses find themselves in situations where their tooling, which is meant to simplify life and streamline processes and automate mundane data movement tasks, are actually breaking and failing. So today, the session will be focused around where do we see these pitfalls, where do multinationals still find this complexity, and what is it stemming from? Maybe more around the drivers that cause these. And we'll be breaking down the session to go through 6 points, which are steps within the payroll process. Could slice and dice the payroll process into various steps, but we try to capture it around 6 main themes of jobs to be done, starting with data collection. There is an event in real life. An employee has been hired to a business, for example, or a bonus has been or is being granted to an employee. Things happen, and the fact that they happen needs to be recorded, and that data needs to be collected somewhere and passed through somewhere else to actually get to payroll and to the employee's bank account eventually, and payslip, or even the fact they get a payslip as a new joiner. Also, data collection will be step 1. We'll speak about what do you then do with that data. You need to send it across to someone or to some system or to load it to a certain system, where then calculations can happen. That will be step 2. We'll capture the step of approval and review of the gross to net, the payroll register figures by the stakeholder that is managing payroll on the business side. That will be step 3. Paying the staff, paying my employees, step 4. We're at 4. Paying employees is an obvious step where all are used to get paid. Processes need to happen for that to actually take place. The timing of payment to employees is the main event of the payroll process. That's the main anchor for all other dates, typically. Pay others. So not only employees need to get funds need to be remitted to authorities or pension providers and the like. And that is also a step in the process, which on its own can be broken down to further steps, but we'll capture it as step number 5 that we'll speak about. And lastly, we'll put a bucket of extracting the information from the payroll run, using that data for various needs, be that accounting or FP&A, budget versus actual analyses, etc. So we'll go through each and we'll speak about what are those failures, why still today, and where still today there are major challenges arising in a global landscape for a business to run payroll. Starting with the first, data collection, especially in this day and age where the classic tool in the stack of businesses to record employee information and to track employee information and those human capital management systems or HRIS platforms that businesses use. Today still, not all mid-market multinational businesses have implemented an HRIS. It varies by size, but it also varies by the focus of the company and whether a priority around HR efforts, data integrity, consolidation, and management has arisen or not. So there are various factors that we see today that companies and the market, to an extent, are expecting for systems such as HRIS solutions to be less of just systems of records and more systems that can also cater to execution of work. As of today, which is late April, without getting into names, a leading HRIS platform, one of the biggest ones in the market, has lost 50% of its market value because of the recent shifts in market with the perception that AI, agentic workflows, AI vibe coding, and the like will essentially have these areas of data storage systems of record transform completely, and the market change completely. But while it still is not the case, and we don't know where that will land in terms of what would be the market dominant workflow to dominant employee source of truth information of the future, it is likely that the HRIS systems in many ways will transform themselves with the market. But that doesn't today yet meet clients, and even when that happens, it doesn't promise that the pitfalls that are happening today will disappear. Today, when a multinational business needs to collect data about their employees, whether they have an HR system or not, will dictate much of how painful the step of data collection for payroll processing takes place, how difficult that step is, how manual that step is, will much be reliant on whether they have an HRIS system and which system that is. Even when there is one, many times multinational businesses will look to acquire a global system or a global platform, which does not necessarily fit all the country specifications of payroll details, employee details that a payroll system would need or a payroll processor would need in order to process payroll. And therefore, there still are manual processes to customize data fields, to align with payroll providers, and to understand how to track what when it comes to what is required for payroll versus what is default on an HR system. If there isn't an HR system, and the process many times becomes much more cumbersome around manual tracking of employee data as a data source of truth. So if we summarize the main pitfalls of data collection, in many ways it still is reliant on people. Even when there is a system of record, someone needs to punch in the data, key in the data. In a streamlined, relatively workflow, an employee can fill in their own details, and that would flow from that first key in systematically all the way down to payroll. But even then there's a key in, of course, but in a broken workflow between the employee providing the data to the employer and the actual payroll processing, there could be 3 hops of manual extraction and keying in or uploading of that information. So it's reliant on people, the manual, audit becomes difficult. Many times it's not even auditable in scenarios like that. And when you look at the global fragmented landscape of countries in which you have staff, you find yourself also in a scenario of there are multiple systems of record, or there could be multiple systems of record, different between countries. Doesn't end with an HRIS. Part of the collect data step is also making sure that leave and time is reported and tracked by the employer in a compliant manner. To the extent it impacts payroll, is to be then transmitted to payroll. If there are equity plans, there are different data points that need to be tracked, and etc. So collecting data starts with how fragmented is a stack of an employer and a multinational business is between the countries and the different kinds of data points and data categories that need to be tracked for correct payroll processing. And even the existence or lack of such systems in the stack is a leading contributor to how painful this process is. So data collection still is painful for many of the multinational businesses and market. But once you've gathered all the information, moving on to step 2, and you are able to, even on one or multiple systems, once you're able to have that source of information that needs to go into payroll processing and be reflected on the employee's actual payment in the bank account and the employee's payslip that they can read and understand, and write taxes, you need to load that information into a different system, a certain payroll engine, typically third-party payroll software. If you're working with that software directly as the employer, meaning you have in-house payroll, or more specifically where we're focusing is you need to transmit that information to another third party who then on their behalf are using the local engine, the area payroll provider and your payroll processor in that capacity. So sending across that information, we're talking about sensitive, private, personal information of employees, including bank account details, including personal identifying information, talking about cross-border transmission of that data in many instances. Beyond the security concerns of sharing such information, there's also the operational burden of having to send that information across. In a good state scenario, there is an integration where systematically between me as the employer, my source of truth for employee and payroll input data gets transmitted directly to the payroll engine or the payroll calculation system that will be using that data. But in many instances today, still that is not the case. And when it is the case, it needs to be managed carefully by proper validations of which data points are mapped to which input fields on a payroll system, so to ensure that there are no mistakes in the actual payroll calculations. So it's challenging to manage third-party communications when you need to send data and that data needs to be clear. And the recipient of the information, recipient of the data, your payroll provider, needs to understand what you mean in the same way that you meant when there isn't a specific structure or many times not even a common language between a person managing the process on the employer side and their payroll provider in a certain country. That process is prone to error and to misunderstanding, which creates back and forth, unnecessary back and forth between the employer and their service provider. Again, waste of time for the employer and the business, but also a challenge to ensure that payroll runs correctly. the lack of systemized integration between an employer source of truth and their service provider or the recipient of their information, their service provider. We mentioned there's also a security concern. That security concern many times is overlooked simply for the benefit of achieving the main goal of payroll, which is paying the employees correct and on time. But that creates risks for the business and creates risks for the scalability of the processes. Sorry, 1 second. Part of the challenge of communicating with third parties, and sometimes via emails, sometimes via calls, and a mix of file transfers, is the lack of auditability and the lack of audit trace and audit trail that can be then analyzed if necessary, when necessary. So sending and loading the information to the service provider has its own challenges, which today we can think about the ways in which the platforms in market promise to solve this. We mentioned that is integration between the source of truth to the local payroll system directly. However, as we started with the fact that the first step, collecting the data, is already broken and is prone to multiple pitfalls, it is then even harder to build upon that, or might not even be possible to build upon that, in order to integrate to the local payroll provider. And in certain instances, when you even do that, it means several hops of data. If there is a system of record on the data collection step, and then there's an integration between that system of record into a payroll platform, that payroll platform, in many cases, could be a global payroll platform, which in turn needs to communicate with local payroll engine. That is another data hub. And that also means there is, even when it's automatic, when it's automated, there is risk for errors and breakage of the transmission of information, of the integrations that needs to be monitored, needs to be managed. And today, it can be done successfully, but it's a challenging process for many. Once the data has been submitted to the provider, to the service provider, on the employer side, there is a waiting game until an employer can receive the payroll register or the payroll numbers or the gross to net, referred to differently, interchangeably in market. That would be for the purpose of reviewing and approving, providing sign-off from the employer side to the provider. In that period, the provider extracts the payroll calculations from the local payroll system. We will not be focusing on the side of the service provider, focusing on the side of the employer. We move to the third step of approving the gross to net calculations. One of the pitfalls, which is still today a significant one, is that there could be an iterative, it's not very linear, the process of payroll as we're describing it. It would be iterative. Once the client sends their service provider the information, waiting for the gross to net to approve, there could be follow-up requests and questions for clarifications and additional data and information required. So that, by definition, will require more manual workflows, at least until there is enough agentic workflow built in to cater for these from the client side. And as we mentioned, we still do not see that today. How quickly that will come about, and in what way, and what new challenges that will create, we will see. Or can talk about hypothesis if we have time in the end. But I'm sure there are enough sessions about that. We'll focus now on step 3, approving the gross to net numbers. has an abundance of challenges of its own still today. For multinational businesses, as an employer, there is a scenario where I have a local team that is approving the numbers, the payroll results. And there is a scenario where I have a global team overlooking the local payroll, approving the numbers, brings about different sets of numbers or challenges, sorry. But in both scenarios, when HQ tries to understand what was approved, similar challenges are coming about. And those include the, firstly, fragmented landscape of formats of payroll register reports that employers receive from different service providers, who many times rely on whatever local engine or local payroll software they use to export that information. In some countries, even the calculations might be done on a spreadsheet and sent back to the employer for approval. In most others, it's an export of the local payroll engine that comes in all flavors, shapes, and formats, some of which are as far from user-friendly as you can imagine, and I'm sure the audience here would know. So these are localized formats. In many cases, they include local pay codes, maybe even in a foreign language or a local language. Much of the local systems are in the local language and also export data in such a manner. Some allow to export in English. Maybe for me, English isn't even the best language to view this, but not either the local language. So that creates its own challenge, but also the different pay elements, employer contributions, are always clear, or let's say more frequently not clear at all than they are. Also creates broken approval workflows. If we're getting a few spreadsheets from our provider that we need to approve, that comes on an email, we approve on our local, and then someone else can view it on their local and pings us on Teams or Slack or whatever, that it looks fine for them. There is no audit trail. There is no workflow management around multi-layer approvals and flows for escalation in cases of certain flags or certain thresholds that are met and can be governed. That is its own challenge, and as the business grows and scalability becomes important, that even compounds. There is no system of monitoring or system of record in those scenarios where the approval is such offline with my service provider. For example, in an employer that has someone who's in charge of approving payroll for a certain country, and that someone might be sick and they're not available at this time, is there anyone who can open up a screen, a summary board, anything, and understand where is the payroll process at a certain given time? Too many cases, the answer is no. And what they would need to do is try and pick the local provider, dig through the emails, see if someone was CC'd, start chasing, in other words, and wasting time, which isn't necessary. So auditability, localization, approval workflows, language barriers, much of these make the payroll process more cumbersome the more countries you're actually operating in. Once the approval has been completed, there could still come additional changes, what we call late changes. And as we said earlier, it's not necessarily a linear process as we're describing it. It could be iterative steps. And that brings about another set of manual processes, which barely have a system of record or even a trail of audit, such as a late bonus request, a late change for commissions, a late lever that wasn't expected. Still today, in many countries in the world, the payday happens before the month ends, and that on its own means that there are guesstimates baked into the payroll inputs, and these might change. And sometimes employers would like to reflect that before payroll is actually paid. And if there's time, great, but that then means there is a new payroll register that needs to be approved again. That then needs to be recorded properly. Version control becomes an issue, especially when you look at it forward. We'll speak about extracting data as one of the later steps around the payroll numbers for accounting and for reporting. And all of a sudden, with different versions, you're starting to lose sight of what's coming from which data source in terms of the payroll numbers. So there are different use cases and scenarios, and just naming a few to showcase the complexity of the real world scenarios with payroll and the fact that it's tied dramatically to real life events by people, and people are unexpectable in many ways. And the fact that it's also tied to regional or local politics in a way. You think of payroll compliance and what type of contributions are mandatory, what type of filings, and when are they required. These are decisions made by different governments in different ways with different preferences at different times. These change and evolve, and that leads in many ways to that localized pay code system complexity of traceability for an external viewer, sort of speak, for someone who isn't local. And that's threaded and embedded into the payroll reality. It's people, it's local regulations, and data movement all around them. But once we have approved the gross to net, once we have a final payroll register, we can think of the next step, which we mentioned as the key milestone for a payroll process. And even at the title of our session, we said in many ways that might be even the simplest part about payroll and the complexities all around it. Paying your people, paying the employees. And here too, there are still challenges today with even fintechs all around us, and much easier international much easier international payments infrastructure than in the past. We still see today lots of limitations with respect to how you can manage even employee payments arising from local regulations, arising from local necessity of a bank account, requiring the relevant currency, needing to pay taxes in a certain way, in a certain manner. Different countries, again, would have their own complications. So focusing on the employees specifically, when there isn't a system to oversee the overarching process of payroll, and payroll runs in a fragmented landscape for a multinational employer, then there isn't an integration between the payroll process and the treasury workflows. The treasury side of the house would need to receive the inputs or the data for how much to pay to whom. That could be jumping from the service provider to the payroll or HR manager managing the process, therefrom to the finance side of the house, specifically to treasury. If it is finance managing the payroll process, might be a different person who manages the payment side versus approving the payroll. So as we see, it's a multi-stakeholder process in all businesses. Employees and employee inputs will always have the HR side of the house, and paying and reporting will always have the finance side of the house. Payroll professionals or payroll titled in their day-to-day staff members are part of that, but sometimes there aren't, and it's part of someone else's, either HR or finance job to manage and deal with payroll. That adds its own complexity, not specifically for paying the employees, but going back to paying the employees, when there isn't an integration between the payroll calculations and approval workflows to the treasury side of the house, that means, yet again, we have some data movement, some clarity that needs to be accompanied. Many times, from a finance standpoint, you would try to understand why are my costs higher or lower to pay to the employees this time, as a sense check of your own step of approval, whether it's an official part or not an official part of the approval process. In many cases, there's a comparison or a variance analysis that a provider will provide a client so they can see analytically what happened to cost to company and to net pay, and to the salaries month over month or payroll cycle over payroll cycle. So to assist with that understanding, but still that understanding stems from emotional, real person necessities, not even necessarily from an official workflow. And that means people who are in charge of making the payment would like to understand what is it about this payment that is different to last month, so that they know they're paying the right amount to the employees. It's a very sensitive process that most people take very, very seriously, and even with a degree of anxiety to an extent, with respect to the accuracy and timeliness of making the payroll payments. There is the challenge of managing the treasury side of foreign exchange currencies and balances and inflows and outflows of the business for a multinational organization. It doesn't specifically only relates to paying employees or payroll specifically. It relates overall, it's true overall for a multinational business with respect to how they're managing their cash flows and various currencies, inflows and outflows. However, in many, of course, service businesses, tech businesses, it depends on the industry, but in many businesses, the payroll and the salary costs are very dominant and are the major cash outflow and operational cost for the business. And therefore, that does take a more significant space within that realm of challenge, managing those treasury aspects. We still see today that while there are, in cases, preferences by employers to not handle the employee payments, and then after other payments we'll get to in a moment, on their own, they still need to pay someone. They still need to pay their service provider, who then manages those remittance of funds to the employees and thereafter to others, and provides a reconciliation report back to the employer. In many cases, there still is a process of that treasury and reconciliation of breakdown. What shape and form that takes is what's different. Whereas in a streamlined desired state, once payroll has been approved, you would have wanted for funds to go and land where they need, maybe with an authorization layer at most that I just need to approve as a user or as a treasury owner in this scenario. But today, in the manual workflows that wrap this are still very significant. In many cases, don't take priority for automation or system replacement versus other preferences of the teams that are in charge of this, as payroll for definitely HR and finance team, less so for payroll teams, obviously, is part of their job. It's not their only job. Other than paying the employees, there is paying others, which has its own challenges when we speak of a global fragmented landscape of a multinational mid-market employer. You need to pay authorities, multiple authorities, pension funds, insurers. There are filings that need to happen. You look to your service provider for the most part to perform those filings, even to trigger or execute the funds on your behalf. That creates its own complexity to the extent or whatever level of outsourcing, whether the provider executes the payments and the employer executes the payments, there still is the aspect of needing to know when, how much money needs to be funded into where, so that treasury can be managed properly, yet again, in a more complex way than the employee payments. Even though employee payments are higher at amount, paying the taxes and statutory payments happen at multiple various dates, versus employee pay dates are highly expectable. But paying other authorities changes by territory. Pay date can also change to employees by territory, less volatile than other payments, and in certain scenarios, those other payments happen to multiple different stakeholders, authorities, and private institutions at different times, at different workflows. Some of it is an accounts payable workflow. And all of that is peripheral payment and money remittance processes that need to happen for payroll to be completed successfully and correctly. We mentioned earlier that paying people, the employees, in a timely and correct manner is critical, or the most critical, the most important goal of successful payroll run. Adjacent or right after that is completing the payroll run fully compliantly, all the payments and the filings being made correctly to the right place at the right time. Today, many businesses still challenge with having visibility and control over how these payments are made and what proof of payments are stored where. There are the more extreme scenarios where employers find that a certain provider hasn't paid the contributions that they've been telling them they would be making. And we saw instances like that, and I'm sure the audience here is familiar with more complex and risky scenarios, which is not the focus today for us. It's more about how painful the process is, but that pain is coupled with the blind spots, the lack of control, the lack of governance of a fragmented landscape. And therefore, it's worth mentioning that this also happens as part of these challenges. So after paying the employees comes paying others, multiple times, multiple dates, multiple amounts to remember or to track, monitor, and ensure execution is performed, and then track, store the proof or the confirmation of everything that needed to happen actually happened. Jump to the next point, but it's good to also highlight, or it's contextually valuable to highlight that by this point, we're beyond the monthly period of the payroll cycle. So if it's a monthly period, typically it is. So in a given month, once we pay the employees, maybe a few days later, the month ends. Only at that following month to the payroll month will the payments to others, as we call it, would go and would be executed. Varying dates, I mentioned, but sometimes it's not even in the following month. It would be on a quarterly basis. And always there would be an annual aspect to it, almost always, like annual returns that need to be generated, need to be produced, need to be filed. And those are happening way after the monthly cycle has happened. But has the monthly cycle been 100% completed before these actions have happened? Not really. We said that after paying people correct and on time, we want to be compliant in our payroll processes. Then only once that annual process is also completed correctly, then we can say that the cycle has been 100% completed, or at least tax year has been 100% completed. Part of it is that cycle, which is completed not at month end, but at least of that specific cycle's filings and other payments that need to happen. So that adds more complexity, but it sits in the similar realm to those paying and filing to other authorities and stakeholders. The sixth step we mentioned for the process, which summarizes or finalizes the payroll process in our breakdown here, relates to extracting the information of the payroll data. and using it for the various use cases that a business needs. And that again involves more the finance side of the house rather than the HR side of the house, although different stakeholders would have different value from using the data. It relates to the accounting side of the house, but also the FP&A functions. Sometimes it could be smaller mid-market where people do more shared responsibilities, would be similar people in charge of those different functions. But in the main core, the core workflows that we're talking about for extracting the information relate to one, accounting. You need to post accounting. You need to post the journal entry in a manner that captures the payroll costs and all the obligations associated with it. In multiple, or most predominantly in market, the journal entry for payroll will be based on a GL or general ledger file that will be provided by the service provider, the payroll service provider, who provides the client with the entries for the accounting system. That in many cases then needs to be manually transformed into the actual format and breakdown and structure that the employer wishes to post payroll to their accounting system for recording it in a consistent manner with their tracking and with their categorizations as they do track it. Mainly from the service provider would have that mapping of the chart of accounts to the pay codes or to ensure things are categorized correctly at the line item level that the provider is providing the journal breakdown in. And after manual transformation, which is on its own a big pitfall and challenge, there is the actual loading of that information to the accounting system, which yet again we see a case of transmitting data from one system of record to another system of record. All that transmission happens with manual touch points, manual editing and transitioning of the data, introducing person dependencies, risk for errors, and also creates, in many cases, fragmented formats for tracking payroll costs in the GL, in the general ledger. And that creates at the global accounting level lack of consistency in the way that the books, yes, the profit and loss statement at the more granular level can be actually broken down and compared between the different countries. For FP&A teams, it means it's harder to understand where budget variations are coming from. Did we miss how much the employer cost, or did we miss a different estimate that we made as the FP&A team when we built the budget? When it's inconsistent and isn't on a like-for-like basis, the data that you get from payroll is hard to then analyze. So looking at the GL isn't always the preferred way for more of an analytical analysis. When we do think of the FP&A side of the house, the data becomes more granular, typically at the general ledger level, again, the accounting level, that is. The data will not be broken down, the payroll costs will not be broken down at an employee level, but rather at a certain reporting attribute level, such as department, cost center, or business unit, or combination. Whereas for more analytical analyses and FP&A purposes, employers or relevant teams would like to also have a more granular breakdown on an employee level, with reference of roles and departments, being able to better understand the costs at a more granular level for different analyses and different projections that are being built by the various teams. There are more advanced mid-market, growing to enterprise even potentially, multinational employers which also have HR analytics on their team, which would be involved in also understanding how to tie payroll amounts to HR softer data points, such as performance, for example. In terms of challenges, being able to standardize the global payroll data or standardize the local payroll data into a global naming convention, into a single data source that is built on a like-for-like basis, that basically serves as a consolidated database of the payroll cost, is the major challenge on this side of extracting the information. So yes, there is the GL we mentioned, but then for even deeper analytics, being able to build that means you need to go back to those fragmented gross to nets and payroll registers we spoke of earlier that were approved, and then standardize these. And you could do it with automations and formulas in various sheets and Excels. However, those reports tend to change and tend to have a new column or different specific pay codes in different months, and the data needs to be converted in terms of currency, and you also need to even know how to tie on a like-for-like basis different cost elements or different contributions on a global level. And that requires manual effort to the extent that the entities that the multinational employer has exceeding 20 or 30 entities even, that becomes a very big role of its own for multiple stakeholders to fit into, so that HQ headquarters could really understand the breakdown of their global payroll costs. So I think we can summarize at this level that extracting the information from payroll, getting that payroll data, to then use it in where we need accounting, analytics, forecasting, budget versus actual, is a cumbersome, challenging process stemming from those fragmented systems and localized payroll reports. And that also means that when someone does that, if they try to tie it back to the local numbers, there might not be even an audit trail, there might not be even a solid way to understand how to tie it back and how to reconcile the numbers. We'll pause here on this point. I think just to tie it to the customer needs and priorities of needs when it comes to goals of successful payroll run. We mentioned the first two as we spoke, but to summarize it in a more structured manner, we'll say there are four. If we put the client needs for the goals of a successful payroll process and payroll landscape, we can say the most important thing is paying the employees correct and on time. That is number one. And ensuring payroll is fully compliant is number two. Then you can worry about making sure it's efficient and you're dealing with the various pitfalls we discussed and we went through today. More painful and more prevalent when you're in a fragmented multinational landscape for processing payroll, as we described today. But then the fourth, more advanced goal, as you are able to build better processes more efficiently, more robust with better governance, you're also able to then think of how do you tie something which is transactional payroll processing to something which is strategic, which is HR planning, and understanding how to leverage the data of payroll that you do have in better understanding how to plan teams looking forward and what actionable insights can I draw from the facts of the past with respect to how much do people cost in different regions for different teams, and how does that impact the business when I plan forward. That would be the top of that needs goals pyramid, and a more advanced one, which goes from transactional to strategic, as I mentioned. So to summarize, I think the goal of today was, and I hope you haven't lost me, and that was a fruitful session for you. But the goal of today with our title was to say that the global payroll sits within an illusion today. It seems like there's an abundance of tools or upcoming automations and tools that are coming to solve all of the challenges, make everything super easy and a nice breeze. But the reality of it is that global payroll is still highly fragmented in the multiple endless ways that companies, multinational employers, cater and solve for this process, create on their return multiple challenges and pitfalls that impact every level of what their goals and needs are from successful payroll processing. And hope we've explained well enough what are the different drivers for the different steps in the process. Where does it break? Where does it fall more so? But the main theme we can see is that the marriage, so to speak, of localized requirements and systems and regulations predominantly which dictate the rest, coupled with global systems which aren't always friendly with those localized aspects, coupled with lack of systems or incomplete systems, coupled with multiple stakeholders at an employer level, coupled with the sensitivity and the anxiety level that comes with being in charge of paying people, the employees, your colleagues, yourself. All of these lead us to understand that solving for payroll to be seamless, easy breezy is still today a challenge. And that's where we and others in market are working on solving it and helping clients better manage that process via an integrated stack, via transforming system of records to system of actual actionability, where systems of payroll operations can actually run rather than simply serve as another layer of recording information manually, trying to understand or to communicate to someone what they're trying to understand. Thank you all for joining the session. I'm David. I hope this was fruitful and interesting for you. I'm open to any feedback and any opinions and thoughts you want to share with me. Please feel free. Would love that. Thank you.